think it only needs to be confidential for the next 48 hours. But look, think of it this way. Suppose you say, look, I don't want you to share this with anybody, but I'm leaving in a month. And I know that the company would be very upset. I know there are rules about this, but you've got to give me a pass. I just want to let you know because I like you. You're a good boss. And then the boss goes into a meeting where they're talking about people and the boss says, well, I'm sorry, but I do have information about my direct. He's leaving in a month. And that affects all kinds of things. The direct says, now that I'm getting promoted, I want the promotion to go through so my other company will see that I've gotten promoted and then I can get the job that I want. Well, the boss can't legitimately allow the company to promote you when the boss knows that you're leaving, right? That's putting your needs, your wants, your interests above the company. And the boss simply cannot do that ethically. So, bottom line, the professional approach is simply to never ask for confidentiality from your boss or any other manager or executive in your entire organization.
Good. Now, this next point might feel a little bit to some folks that we're beating a dead horse, but we've really got to say this because our experience suggests that some of you just aren't listening. And so you cannot assume that this confidentiality clause can be evoked. It happens to us all the time. Whenever we talk about confidentiality, and probably about 1,000 other topics,
right.
This situation plays itself out, right? We get asked, and then we have this really black and white, crisp answer, right? Where we're direct, we're clear, we're completely unwavering in our answer. And
right.
As soon as we say, no question, black and white, unequivocal, do this, you have no choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As soon as we say that, we get, but wait. This situation is different. My boss said what actually led up to this was, and we get 1,000 caveats. We listen, usually, and then repeat our black and white answer. Folks just don't get it sometimes.
Yeah, and confidentiality is one of those situations where folks seem to think the situation, the wording, the way the question was asked, what the boss did, how good the relationship is, somehow their situation allows for some future scenario where confidentiality can be invoked or assumed or created or allowed, and the fact is it can't. It's funny. Suppose somebody says, okay, off the record here, blah, blah, blah. Well, look, this is important fundamental stuff when it comes to professionalism, folks. The person with the confidential information, the one who wishes confidentiality from the other person, that person can never invoke confidentiality from the other person by rushing or by making a statement. One certainly can't get it by saying so after or even right before making some sort of confidential utterance. Right? And look, we hear this when we get the question about confidentiality and people want to trump the black and white answer that we give. There's often talk of trying to compare managers and directs, right? The professional relationship that exists there with or even with other employees to reporters or politicians, for instance, who go off the record with reporters. What's funny about that is when the example is brought up, it's clear the person who's using the comparison, trying to convince us to say their situation is different, completely misunderstands the whole issue of confidentiality and off-the-recordness, if you will, of politicians and reporters. If a source or an interviewee says, off the record, blah, 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 there is no guarantee of confidentiality, folks. That is a rookie mistake.
Why is that?
Okay, because look, in order to get confidentiality, you have to ask the other person. We can't simply invoke it. You can't go around creating obligations for other people simply by saying things out loud. You cannot do it, right? Now, what's interesting about that, you can in an organization, if you're a manager to direct, right? But although a manager can't invoke confidentiality with his directs about personal stuff, but you can't simply invoke it. I can't walk up to you and say, what I'm about to tell you is confidential, because you're not able to do it. It would be as if you could walk through your life making everything confidential to everybody.
Right.
No matter what the situation, no matter the clever comparison, you can't invoke or in any way get any confidentiality from our boss based on a deathbed utterance, none of that stuff. Any confidentiality that's offered to you is inherently suspect. It's essentially, therefore, unprofessional. It's almost two wrongs not only don't make a right, but they make a really, really dangerous wrong when a person who doesn't know better asks a manager for confidentiality and then the rookie manager offers it. right? It never should have been asked because it's against the fundamental principle of being a manager, and the manager can't offer it, and yet he or she does so. And now we've got someone thinking they can get something, the other person thinking they can, in fact, offer it to them, and then, of course, something trumps it, and everybody's miserable.
Right. Well, okay, there's a couple of other analogies that people talk about when talking about confidentiality with their managers, and we probably ought to address those as well, just to be complete. So,
and these are a little, to me, these seem different than manager direct, but nevertheless, they are professional. They are widely understood or talked about in the doctor-patient privilege, priest-penitent privilege, and lawyer-client privilege, right? But the comparisons are totally flawed for an interesting reason. Look, that type of confidentiality that a priest or a doctor or a lawyer provides does increase communication, and it's good communication, effective communication. Talking to a priest, knowing it's truly private, being able to be candid with your doctor or a lawyer, it increases those effective communications. But any comparison to the manager in this situation is flawed. And the reason is because in all those cases, the confidentiality is built around the patient or the penitent or the client. The oath of the professional, the doctor or priest, right, is designed around the individual. But managers and directs can have no illusion about whom the manager is serving. When we're a manager, we don't ever serve our directs. We always serve our organization. In fact, when you think about it, to a direct, a manager is our organization. So a manager can't grant us something which isn't theirs to grant. So the comparisons are interesting, but they don't hold water because the fundamental principles underlying the relationship are fundamentally changed.
Okay. Now, I can hear a number of our listeners really rebelling against this idea because in their mind, they think that we're suggesting that there's no trust here.
Yeah. People say, well, if we're working for a trusting relationship, why can't I trust my boss? And I think what we feel is that supposition is built on an inherent fallacy that there are only two types of relationships. Ones that are completely trusting and totally open, and ones that are completely untrusting. In other words, if I trust you, I can trust you completely, totally, in all ways, in all shapes and forms. And of course that's false, right? We trust our spouses and we trust our kids. But do we trust our 12-year-old as well as we do our 20-year-old? Do we trust our mother as much as we trust our brother? There are things we would tell our spouse that we would not tell our brother, things we would tell our brother we would not tell our mother, right? And yet we would probably consider all of them trustworthy, and we would describe ourselves as being in a trusting relationship with each one of them. And what that means is there is essentially a sliding scale of trust. If there are friends that you would say, oh, she's my best friend, right? And so I can trust her completely. And actually some people would say, well, no, she's my best friend, but I would not trust her completely. So when somebody suggests that confidentiality is inherent in a trusting boss-subordinate relationship, which, by the way, if I'm the subordinate I'm working on, I'm being candid and open and professional in my communications and one-on-ones and so on. My boss is developing me. He treats me fairly and so on. If they say that confidentiality is inherent in that it's assumed, right? I think what we're doing is conflating two ideas that don't need to go together and frankly don't go together in almost any other relationship we have. We totally can have a trusting relationship with our boss and yet still understand they can't grant us confidentiality, right? We can have a trusting relationship and if they mistakenly offer confidentiality, still choose not to share with them and not have it affect the relationship. So folks, when we talk about confidentiality, we're not suggesting, oh, this is one of those fundamental things that proves that your boss is always your boss. Well, your boss is always your boss. And we have to recognize that because they bring special powers and obligations to our relationship with them. But that doesn't mean you can't trust them in many ways and still recognize you can't expect confidentiality from a boss because they can't offer it to you.
Good. Well, Mark, I thought this was a really good show, and I was sharing with you before we started recording that this is something as former managers and executives we absolutely understand, right? There's no question in our mind, and sometimes, like you said earlier in the show, sometimes you forget what you know. And
right.
Although we know it, I can't recall ever reading anything or having a discussion with someone about this very important point relative to communications with my boss. Never.
You know what? I think that is? I think it's because it boils down to The people who might talk about it, there might be a paragraph or two in a book where people talk about it and they talk about it theoretically, and they say the boss's responsibility is all to the company. Although God forbid you read a book and somebody says, well, the relationships are shifting and all that kind of stuff, because that's real humanity and so on. Well, you want to put that book down. But if in fact it were brought up, it would brought up theoretically, and it would start to break down, because some of those people writing about it, academics, would say, okay, what does that mean when somebody asks for confidentiality? And frankly, there are people in the business world who say, no, ER and HR, you can share confidential things, and that confidentiality really can't be violated. Well, no, that's not true at all. There's no executive who runs HR or ER who would allow that. I think it's because it breaks down. You can talk about it theoretically, but people don't want to say, okay, what would I recommend in the day-to-day life of a typical manager and subordinate? And so you and I understand it. Part of it comes from our early experience with having to be leaders and managers very quickly in our lives, and learning the mistakes of thinking that someone can share confidentiality with us. But the bottom line is, people don't talk about this, and yet senior people know it, and they know you can't allow it. And yet, it'd be nice if everybody had a mentor. On the other hand, not everybody does. And so somebody's got to share it. And that's why we're doing it.
Good. Well, I hope people listen, because this is one of those things that it might be uncomfortable and you may not like it, but violate this and it will end up in tears often. So
yeah, and look, we don't want it to be, we don't want to be cynical about this. We want to share it with you because it's a reasonable thing for organizations to have managers to have a relationship with the company first. It's a reasonable part of a professional life. And this is one of the outcomes that may not be perfect, but once you understand it, it's easy to behave around it. So we're not cynical, we're realists, and we want everyone to know what we know. And that's why we do this. So wrapping up, there's never any confidentiality with any manager ever. Don't ask for it. Don't expect it. Don't assume it can be invoked with some clever phrase, or do it before the fact or after the fact, or just make a statement. And to be fair, you still can have a trusting relationship with your boss without having confidentiality. Lack of confidentiality is not an indication of a lack of a trusting professional relationship.
Good. All right, my friend. Thanks.
Thanks, partner.
All right. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone. That's it. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next week. So long.